Welcome back, everyone, to my round 8 recap from Biel. In this one, I played WGM Huang Qian from China. I do apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name, but my opponent is over 2,400 FIDE and hasn't been super active in recent years, but had a lot of games for me to look over. And I decided before the game I would go into an opening that I've never played before, and it's an opening I really only learned this morning. That opening being the C3 Sicilian. And the reason I chose to play this was for a few reasons. For one, I knew that there's no way she would be preparing this before the game, given that I have, I think, no games in the database as white in this position. And secondly, I was inspired by none other than Daniel Naroditsky, who I was watching play a tournament in Charlotte a few weeks ago. And he played a really nice line against Grandmaster Jian Chao, which seemed to go into very deep theory. And I basically used that game as a model for my opening preparation. And what I actually ended up doing was compiling all of Naroditsky's chess.com games into openingtree.com and looking at his C3 Sicilian repertoire. I did a similar approach a few days ago for a different round when preparing knight f3 and e3 and looking at Hikaru's games. But I thought it's a cool way to basically learn an opening in a single day. And this morning I was scouring through a lot of Naroditsky's games, seeing what he plays against various lines in this opening. And my opponent played knight f6, which I don't think she's ever played before, at least in a recorded game. I found 2 games where she played d5, and this was the main line I was preparing. But knight f6 is definitely a critical move, and I think it's the most popular move against the C3 Sicilian. And I did check this before the game. I played pawn e5, knight d5, and knight f3. And after knight c6, I played bishop c4. And I was actually following the game that Naroditsky played against Jian Chao. And we still followed the game after knight b6, bishop b3. It's all still prep. And in Naroditsky's game, his opponent played d5, after which takes was played. In my game, d6 was played, and I knew that there's a potential transposition. I still take, even if it's not en passant. My opponent takes back, and I castle. And I did have this position on my computer this morning, and what I was mainly preparing was if black plays c4, there's an interesting line, bishop c2, bishop g4, rook e1, and knight e5. And this is actually the game between Naroditsky and Jian Chao, after which rook takes e5 was played, and after bishop takes f3, queen e1. And I was preparing a bit more deeply from here, but it seems like a line where white can keep a small advantage. And it's just very tricky too, given that black has to choose where to put the bishop, and the c-pawn is a bit overextended. There's ideas later of b3 or knight a3, or even in some cases bishop a3 to harass the queen. So I would have been most comfortable going into this. But my opponent played a different line. Instead of going for c4, she played bishop e6. And I was kind of hitting myself during the game, not physically, but more metaphorically, because this morning I was checking the database and I knew this is a major line. And I told myself I would come back to check this line after I looked at the other lines in this variation, but I never actually ended up coming back to check bishop e6. So unfortunately, I was on my own in this position, and yeah, I really should have done a little bit more work, but this is the downside of trying to learn a completely new opening right before the game is I only had so much to cram right beforehand. Now, thankfully, I still knew some basic ideas in this position. Of course, with this c3 move, white really wants to get in d4 as quickly as possible, and I figured that I can play d4 right away, which I did. And after she takes, I was still not in specific prep, but I knew an idea that very often white doesn't have to take back immediately. And there's an alternative move here, knight to a3, which I took a long time calculating, and I ended up playing, given that it looks like a nice way to keep the position very tricky for black. Now, there's lines here where if black takes on c3, then white's essentially gambiting a pawn, but I thought this would be very fun to go into. I was planning to play knight to b5, hitting the queen, and essentially forcing the trade after takes. There's a lot of tension still, given the pawns are staring at each other, the bishops are staring at each other, but black has to deal with a maiden one threat on c7, basically a triple fork mate. So I was calculating this line, expecting that if we got into this, black would have to play rook c8, and then I could take, and take. And if we got to this position, I think I'd be pretty comfortable, even though white's down a pawn and queens are traded. These pawns are very ugly for black, and very likely I can win back at least one of the pawns with a preferable position. But we didn't quite go into that, because after knight a3, she played the move pawn a6, which I think is a very useful prophylactic move, simply preventing knight b5, because there are so many lines where if black doesn't prevent this move, then knight b5 gets a ton of initiative for white. And in this position, I decided to trade. I took on e6 first, and after queen takes, I take on d4 with the knight. I didn't want to take back with a pawn and leave myself with an isolated queen's pawn, so after takes, I take with queen. And we reached a position where I was feeling pretty good, given that I'm already castled, and black's a little bit slow to develop the king side, especially with the queen blocking the e-pawn blocking the bishop, the g-pawn is pinned by the queen on d4. So it seems like white has a nice advantage in this position, but the advantage is only temporary. And depending on how the next several moves go, if black can complete development in castle, then it should probably be equal. So the next several moves are, I think, very critical. And she started with rook d8, posing the question where I should put my queen. I decided to play queen h4, getting out the way. But still, I think this is a useful square, given that if black ever plays g6, there's ideas of bishop h6, and if black plays queen f6 offering the queen trade, I would have bishop g5 with tempo. So here she played queen c6, and now black's plan is very clear of playing e6 and developing the bishop and castling as soon as possible. So I took a lot of time in this position trying to figure out the best approach to try and slow down black's development, and also just try and make threats in the position. And the move I wanted to play was bishop e7, which would prevent the e-pawn from moving, but I rejected this move because I wasn't sure about f6, just kicking my bishop, and even though it seems like an accomplishment to provoke f6, if I play bishop e3 back and then e5, it just seems like black is doing okay here, and I didn't see any clear way to kind of disrupt black's development of bishop d6 and castling, or bishop e7 and castling. So I decided to play bishop e3 immediately, with the idea that after e6, I take on b6. And at first this looks like I'm not really achieving much, I'm just simplifying, perhaps in black's favor, but the idea is after queen takes, I have queen a4 check. And I'm really trying to keep the initiative and keep the pressure. And what I was hoping for is if she plays queen c6 offering a queen trade, I would happily trade queens and then get an endgame where my knight comes to c4, and I'd eventually play rook d1. I think white is significantly better here. Even though it's equal material, I think the knight is just much better than the bishop, and black is left with these long-term weaknesses on the queen side, two isolated pawns. So this didn't quite happen because she didn't play queen c6, and instead she played rook d7, which at first maybe looks very uncomfortable for black, essentially self-pinning, and now the king is tied down to defending the rook. But it's not so easy for white to exploit the pin, and in the game I did my best. I played rook to d1, of course threatening the rook. She defended, and then I played rook d3, preparing the double up. And it seems very close to being very good for white, but she has this move bishop to d6, essentially relieving all the pressure on the d-file and getting ready to castle next move. And I didn't see anything better than what I played in the game. Rook d1, she castled, And now black is threatening to take on h2, so I played g3. And then she played what I think is a very precise move, rook d to d8. And maybe it seems more natural to play rook f d8, but then the bishop would still be pinned to the d7 rook. So after rook d d8, the plan for black is to play bishop e7 or bishop c5, and then just neutralize the d file. And at this point, it really just felt like my advantage has completely evaporated. I'm not sure if I was even that much better during the game, but what ended up happening was I played knight c4, she played bishop c5, and I traded rooks and played queen c2 and offered a draw, and she accepted it, and the game ended very peacefully. Not too much fireworks towards the end, but I think it was a pretty clean game. And if we check with the engine this game, we do have kind of a special occurrence that neither of us made any inaccuracies, mistakes, or blunders. According to Lichess Stockfish, it was a perfect game by both of us. Although maybe there were some moments that could have been improved, maybe very slight improvements. For example, I think after bishop c5, I did have this move queen a5, which the engine seems to like, although it didn't even cross my mind. It just seemed like a weird idea for the queen. So I really can't be too upset with this game. I was happy with the opening preparation. It's always nice to employ a new weapon and to surprise the opponent early, but I think she handled the opening very well and played very accurately to neutralize my activity in the early middle game. So this puts me at 4.5 out of 8 points. This is my second draw in a row against a high-rated player. So really no complaints. I think my last 2 games have been very, very clean on my part. So hopefully I can continue the clean play going into tomorrow. Tomorrow will be the penultimate game, and I am a little bit behind with recording the recaps, so I'm not sure which day this will be posted, but do stay tuned for more chess. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next recap.